Jewish community, I want you to know, I see your fear, your hurt, your pain.
A judge denied Trump's lawyers' request for a mistrial. They took issue with the testimony from Daniels.
We have been very clear from here about our concerns about major operations. We have been very clear from here about protecting civilians.
Hello, everyone. I'm Weijia Jiang in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. With just 6 months until Election Day, developments in Lower Manhattan and the Middle East could have a major impact on the presidential race here at home. In New York, adult film actor Stormy Daniels took the stand in former President Donald Trump's criminal trial. Today, the judge denied Trump's request for a mistrial based on her testimony. Daniels received $130,000 in 2016 in exchange for her silence about an alleged sexual encounter with Trump. He is accused of falsifying business records to try and cover up those payments.
This was a very big day. A very revealing day. As you see, their case is totally falling apart. They have nothing on books and records, and even something that should bear very little relationship to the case. It's just a disaster.
Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Israel sent tanks into Rafah and has taken control of the Gazan side of a key border crossing to Egypt. The move comes just hours after the Israeli government rejected a ceasefire proposal backed by Hamas. Ed O'Keefe is at the White House with more on the Biden administration's opposition to that operation in Rafah. But we're going to start with Errol Barnett in Lower Manhattan. Errol, I'm so glad we have you now because everyone wants to know, what did Stormy Daniels say today in court?
Hey there, Weijia. Great to reconnect with you. Well, today, Stormy Daniels detailed much of what we already knew, but the difference is she's saying all of this under oath in a court of law. How she met Donald Trump, how the sexual encounter came to be, how uncomfortable she was during that episode, how she was offered by Trump to appear on The Apprentice, and how she subsequently, in the years that followed, feared for her safety. And that's how we got to that $130,000 alleged hush money payment to her for the rights of her story so that she didn't share it around the 2016 election. But, Weijia, she was, in the words of, or to use my words in describing how the judge described her, she was too verbose. She spoke too quickly and said too much. And that's why Donald Trump's defense team moved for a mistrial, because they said, look, despite the contours of what she could be asked, when prosecutors asked her a question, she gave too many details and went beyond what the question was, as it related to what Trump was wearing, as it related to Trump saying that he and his wife slept in separate bedrooms, and that's why the affair was okay. And Judge Merchan had to tell her there were a number of objections, but he had to keep intervening and saying, you're saying too much. Now, he did not allow for there to be a mistrial, but he will limit what the jury can take from her testimony, because he does find that most of it is useful, and it is quite damaging to the former president's denial. But she was a real star witness of the trial so far.
But, Errol, this trial is not about their intimate moments. It's not about that sexual encounter. It is about the payment that is alleged here, and the fact that, you know, the question of whether Trump knew about it. So what does the prosecution hope to get out of her testimony?
That's a fantastic point, Weijia. This case hinges on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. And on Monday, the jury got to see the actual checks with Donald Trump's signature on them that were payments from him to his lawyer, Michael Cohen, for this hush money episode. What prosecutors are trying to lay out, and we've watched this happen each week, is you have almost one star witness who's notable and recognizable and close to the case, whether it was David Pecker or Stormy Daniels today. And then you have witnesses who are more technical. People like Rona Graff, who was Trump's assistant, who could confirm that she put Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal's contact information in Trump's contact list. Today, with Stormy Daniels, you had the reverse. We had someone who confirmed, or Stormy confirmed, that her that she was able to put Donald Trump's contact information through Rona Graff into her phone. And so this isn't necessarily just about the hush money, it's about the narrative in general. And the jury just has to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump lied on those checks to cover up this salacious alleged affair. And so that's why you see the prosecution trying to get as close to the salacious line as possible, but Judge Juan Merchan kind of limiting them and pushing them back and saying the jury doesn't need to know all of the details as it relates to that alleged encounter.
That makes total sense, Earl. Thank you. And Donald Trump also posted today and then deleted a Truth Social post mentioning that he had just recently been told who the witness is today. How is Trump responding to the judge's threat yesterday of possible jail time for future gag order violations? Sometimes, you know, he just can't help himself.
Well, Ouija, you've almost answered your question in the question, because for Donald Trump to post something to Truth Social and then delete it within 30 minutes, that's new. But it does speak to how frustrated he is, and he says as much when he enters and leaves the courtroom. In his words, this is just a conspiratorial trial from the left, when in reality, there are real charges based on evidence and documents and testimony that everything behind me is based on. And so the fact that he posted and deleted suggests that he took Judge Merchan's threat seriously on Monday, when the judge said, look, after these 10 gag order violations, the next step is to lock you up. CBS understands that they've made accommodations for that between the Secret Service, court clerks, and the NYPD, and Donald Trump is well aware.
Well, you're right, Errol. He is not somebody that typically resends anything. Thank you for all of your reporting.
That's right.
We have new details about a U.S. soldier being detained in Russia. Staff Sergeant Gordon Black was arrested last week in a Russian city not far from the Chinese and North Korean borders. The Pentagon says he was stationed in South Korea. The soldier's mother says Black, who is accused of stealing from a woman, was in Russia visiting his girlfriend. The U.S. has warned Americans for months not to travel to the country and had urged U.S. citizens living there to leave immediately. The White House works to broker a deal in Gaza as Israeli forces move in on Rafah. Our panel is standing by to break it all down. You're streaming America Decides.
This appears to be a limited operation, but of course much of that depends on what comes next. They have said, I think quite clearly, it's no secret that they want to conduct a major military operation there. We have made clear that we oppose such an operation.
That was State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller this afternoon on Israel's operations in Rafah. Miller said the United States is still working to achieve an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages in Gaza. Let's bring in our reporter panel, Sabrina Siddiqui and Alexander Ward. Sabrina is a national politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Alex is a national security reporter for Politico. It's great to see you both. So, Alex, I have your latest article here, and basically you make the point that the administration has been pretty murky in terms of what they consider to be an invasion into Rafah, and also what consequences there may be if that happens. So what does their message today tell you about those two things?
Well, look, every time an administration official says they've been clear, I wince a little bit because they just clearly haven't. I mean, in one end, actually, Miller says at one point, this is actually the prelude to a major invasion. And then he was pressed on that. He goes, actually, no, it's not a prelude, or it is a prelude. He wasn't sure. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, tells reporters first that it's, it's not they're against a major operation. And then it's, well, we're against an operation that's big or small. But then with the caveat of, well, a small operation that puts a lot of people at risk. So basically, what is it? Is it that now that the Israelis are in Rafah, is this an invasion? If it's not the invasion that they're worried about, well, then how big can it get? They just aren't as clear or as providing the kinds of parameters that they need to provide. And at this point, the Israelis have defied the United States. They've gone into Rafah, and we don't see any reprimand or any sort of push against that in the coming days.
And Sabrina, does it seem like they are creating some space for themselves to not have to change U.S. policy, even though it was just last month that they said, look, if Israel doesn't change its policies or strategies, we're going to have to. But now, despite the fact that there is an invasion, although limited in scope, according to the administration, there aren't repercussions.
You know, I think that on the one hand, you see this delay that the administration has confirmed with respect to certain shipments, weapon shipments to Israel, but they're reiterating that there's no change in overall policy, right? They're not withholding aid or pulling support from the Israeli government and its military offensive in Gaza more broadly. And I think part of that is because the White House was sounding a very optimistic tone today about a possible, ceasefire deal that would involve the release of the hostages that are currently being held by Hamas in exchange for some kind of temporary ceasefire in Gaza. And that is the administration's top priority. So, getting too aggressive in their approach with the Israeli government or being too outwardly critical is something that I think they feel would jeopardize their leverage with the Israeli government after a very tense period, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the relationship between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, as we know, has really deteriorated in recent months. So I think a lot of it really just has to do with, on the one hand, reckoning with this, invasion, the Rafah operation underway, where there's about 1.5 million Palestinians who are sheltering, a lot of concerns about the civilian impact, even if it's limited in its scope, as what the Israelis are saying, with, of course, balancing that with their hope that maybe the Hamas and Israel are closer to a ceasefire deal than they have been in months, and just trying to get that through.
Well, of course, because if there is a ceasefire deal, the issue of Rafah sort of takes care of itself, right? Because there would be at least a temporary ceasefire. So today we heard from John Kirby, a spokesperson for the National Security Council, that things are looking pretty good. But do you have any, what does that mean at this point?
I mean, they look good in the sense that there are people talking right now in Doha, right? The CIA director, Bill Burns, is there. They're having their conversations. The confusion yesterday over what deal Hamas might have agreed to or not has somewhat resolved itself. It seems like it was changed language, but based off of the Israeli proposal. So maybe that they're closer than we initially thought. But the fact that those conversations are ongoing and they might be closer than they thought, that leads to some optimism. But it's one of those things where, no deal is done until it's done.
And the biggest sticking point really is just that, right now Hamas is essentially embracing a ceasefire deal that would be in phases, with initially more of a temporary ceasefire, but eventually, as it's phased in, require the withdrawal of essentially all Israeli troops from Gaza. So, an end to a more permanent ceasefire, whereas Israel, of course, has said, Netanyahu has categorically ruled out ending the war in its entirety, and Israel is still only open to a temporary ceasefire. So that appears to be the biggest sticking point. But of course, the stakes for Biden are extremely high in an election year, where this has just really dominated the domestic political climate here at home, where he's facing backlash over his handling of the war with key constituencies that the Democratic Party is relying on in November. And so for them, I think achieving some kind of ceasefire deal in the hopes that it would, I think settle things in Gaza, at least for a few months, that's really, I think, high priority for this administration and would really ease some of the political fallout for them.
Yes, and the pressure on President Biden, because, I know we don't like to talk in hypotheticals, but if there is not a ceasefire deal, and if this invasion into Rafah becomes greater, and the administration does or does not respond, can you talk about the political implications of that?
Well, the polling is a little weird on this, right? Because in Michigan, where there's been a lot of attention on, how Arab Americans and Muslim Americans in that state have been feeling about the war, Biden occasionally polls like he's ahead. Most people seem to be focused on inflation, economic issues, than they are on the war, which does not take away the fact that there are massive, wide-scale campus protests, that there is immense dissatisfaction, especially from younger Democrats or progressives, with his Israel policy. But I think you've seen the president. I mean, he spoke to this when he gave the speech about the protests. Right? I mean, he basically said, You're welcome to protest, have fun, you haven't changed my mind. And nothing's really going to change Biden's mind here. The only thing that changes his opinion on pretty much anything is if his inner circle revolts. And so far, there's been no defections, there's been no anger. Yes, there have been some lower level resignations from throughout the government, but no one that Biden necessarily knows or cares about. And so in that case, it seems like it's falling on deaf ears effectively.
And this is very difficult, tricky ground for the administration. And thank you both so much for sharing your reporting with us today, Alexander Ward and Sabrina Siddiqui. We're following breaking news as the Florida judge in former President Trump's classified document cases postpones the trial. We'll have team coverage next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Former President Donald Trump's classified documents case in Florida has been postponed indefinitely. You may remember that original trial date was set for May 20th. Judge Eileen Cannon, citing significant issues around classified evidence, says that would need to be worked out before the federal criminal case goes to a jury. Our Scott McFarland and Jessica Levinson join us now. Scott, talk to us about why the judge issued this ruling today.
There was an anticipation this trial date was written in invisible ink in the first place. The prospect of a May trial seemed far-fetched because the docket is just saturated with legal challenges from the Trump team and these complex classified records issues that are unique to this case because it's about the alleged mishandling and exposure of America's classified secrets. What the judge has said here in this 5-page ruling is there are these intertwined issues involving the legal challenges and the classified records issues that it's just not tenable to have a trial in May or to set a firm trial date at all right now, which raises the prospect, if not the likelihood, this trial would happen well after the 2024 election, which means if Donald Trump were to win, this trial might not happen at all. It's the same dynamic impacting that January 6th, 2020 election conspiracy trial here in Washington. The delays raise the prospect a trial might not happen if Donald Trump wins the presidency. Not a big surprise, but a pretty definitive ruling today from Judge Eileen Cannon, who, it's worth underscoring, was appointed to the bench by Donald Trump.
And Jessica, can you explain more of that ruling, more of her reasoning about why she came to this decision?
So exactly as Scott said in his fine reporting, that she said there's just a lot of evidentiary issues to sort out. And she is pointing to the fact that we're talking about some concerns about national security, and that does raise additional questions for any judge when they're overseeing a trial like this. Having said that, I'm not aware of a situation where, or I should say it's quite uncommon, where a judge says, you know, this is just really tricky, so let's just take it off of the calendar completely. We certainly have seen delays. We've seen delays from this judge. We've seen delays from other judges. That's appropriate. That's not unusual. But to have a judge say, this is a tough one, there's just so much to sort through, let's put it off and not set any additional deadline. That, I think, for people watching at home is interesting and rare because typically when it comes to trials, everything is keyed to that trial date. So you set the trial date, even if you know in the beginning of a case that it's aspirational, and then everything works back from that trial date. So taking it off calendar, which is really what she's done, is quite significant here.
Did she offer any explanation other than that it would be a lot of work?
Well, I think not just a lot of work, but what she's saying is that it's a lot of really tricky and complex work. And part of this is, frankly, that the former president, again, as Scott mentioned, filed lots and lots of motions. So she does have a lot to go through in this case. Now, having said that, there are cases where there is a very heavy and aggressive motion practice. And I still haven't seen a situation where the judge says, the best thing to do is take it off calendar. Now, I think what would have been, frankly, in my mind, perhaps more expected and or frankly, I think appropriate would be some sort of significant delay. Because again, if you keep that trial date, at least you are keying decisions and motions to some date certain in the future, even if it has to keep getting pushed back.
And Scott, I imagine for the Trump campaign, their main line was whether this was going to happen before or after the presidential election. So is this a win for them?
Well, if their MO is to delay, which it seems to be, this is exactly what they'd be hoping for. An indefinite delay, as Jessica said, not even a new date. There's just no date any longer. All that being said, of the two special counsel prosecutions, the one in Florida over classified records and the one here in Washington over alleged election subversion, it's the latter, the election case that was built for speed. It was narrow. There are no co-defendants. There are only 4 charges. They don't even get deeply into the issues of January 6th. And they've made that case more elastic, more flexible. And that case has been stalled, too. There was not much of an aspiration from those who've been monitoring the case in Florida that it was going to go first or it was going to go early. There was this sense it was going past the election anyhow, which allows for a possible silver lining for Jack Smith that allows him to marshal his attention and his resources towards the case here in Washington if, Ouija, The Supreme Court releases that case back to the court. You'll recall they're reviewing the issue of presidential immunity with a ruling not likely till late June. It's not clear there's enough time to have a trial before the election in Washington, but stalling the Florida case at least gives the special counsel the ability to focus his attention on Washington if that case does get the trial before November.
So, Jessica, what happens now? I mean, especially since we don't have an alternate date.
So what happens now is that the judge has indicated that she'll keep working on these issues, but let's be honest, we're not having a trial before the election. I mean, that was sure beforehand, but it is absolutely certain now. Scott mentioned the other federal case, the election interference case, and he's exactly right that we're waiting on the Supreme Court when it comes to this question of whether or not a former president enjoys some, none, or complete immunity from criminal prosecution. We're also waiting on a separate case, I would offer, from the Supreme Court about whether the obstruction statute that Jack Smith used as part of the charges in that federal election interference case, if that statute even applies to the activities of January 6th. So what happens now is that we continue to look at the New York hush money trial as, frankly, I think the only trial that's going forward before the election. And depending on what happens in the election, potentially the only trial that moves forward at all. Because for the two federal cases, if Trump wins the election, he can ask his attorney general to dismiss them. A judge would still have to agree. For the state case, he would make different arguments, but he would say that a state criminal trial proceeding against him as the head of the federal executive branch would create separation of powers concerns. So everything kind of slows down, frankly, at this moment while we wait for the Supreme Court and we watch the continuation of the hush money trial.
There are so many trials, there are so many developments, and we are grateful to you, Jessica Levinson and Scott MacFarlane, for making sense of them for us. Thank you.
This ancient hatred of Jews didn't begin with the Holocaust. Didn't end with the Holocaust either.
From our college campuses to communities across the country, President Biden condemns the rise of anti-Semitism as he announces new measures to protect our nation's Jewish people. You are streaming America Decides. President Biden forcefully condemned hateful rhetoric and violence against Jewish people today during a ceremony remembering the victims of the Holocaust.
We've seen a ferocious surge of anti-Semitism in America and around the world. Too many people denying, downplaying, rationalizing, ignoring the horrors of the Holocaust. And October 7th, including Hamas's appalling use of sexual violence to torture and terrorize Jews. It's absolutely despicable, and it must stop.
His speech comes only days after the Anti-Defamation League and Tel Aviv University published a report revealing anti-Semitism soared across the U.S. last year. It shows the number of anti-Jewish hate crimes more than doubled between 2023 and 2022. CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd joins us now. Sam, it is great to see you. I want to talk about the president's speech today because he not only denounced anti-Semitism, he talked about new measures to try to combat it. Was there anything new today that he announced?
Well, let's remember, this is the first president to ever have issued a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. When I was at the Department of Homeland Security working to address hate-fueled violence, we initiated a series of new grant funding, information sharing, and a public website to prevent targeted violence and terrorism. Today, the president did announce a set of new steps that really build on that national strategy. For example, there is currently a law that prohibits discrimination by any federally funded program or activity on the basis of race, color, national origin, and other categories. President Biden announced today that his administration has really re-upped their information sharing with federally funded entities and programs to remind them of those commitments. On the access to resources front, President Biden announced today that the Department of Homeland Security will create a new website that will contain information about resources available to address anti-Semitism. On the partnerships front, President Biden announced today that the ambassador at the State Department who leads work to address anti-Semitism is going to convene tech platform leaders to talk about the anti-Semitism on their platform. So his announcements today build on the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism and are sorely needed.
And of course, he also talked about what we are seeing on college campuses as it relates to the protests as a result of the Israel-Hamas war. I want to take a listen to some of what he said.
There is no place on any campus in America, any place in America, for anti-Semitism or hate speech or threats of violence of any kind. Violent attacks, destroying property, is not peaceful protest. It's against the law. And we are not a lawless country.
And this is not the first time he has condemned the violence that we are seeing on college campuses, but I wonder if stakeholders feel like he is doing enough because he hasn't traveled, as an example, to any colleges to speak to students.
Well, I think nuance is important from the president's perspective, from a law enforcement perspective, and we are seeing so many different kinds of activities on college and university campuses. We have First Amendment protected activity that is critically important. We have civil unrest, which is by definition nonviolent. And we have actual criminal activity that is posing a public safety risk. The federal government's response here has been to remind college and university presidents about their obligations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which again prohibits discrimination on the basis of national origin, race, and other matters. And I think it is very important that the Department of Education follow up on their investigations into any violations of Title VI, and that President Biden continues to reiterate the right to peaceful protest as well as the consequences for breaking the law.
And Sam, I do want to ask you a personal question because you are the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. And obviously, every year you mark this very emotional day. But how is this year different given all that we just talked about?
Because of the explosion and normalization of anti-Semitism and hate-fueled violence in this country, this Holocaust Remembrance Day feels very different. My father, Serge, somehow survived the Holocaust as a child in France. So many members of my family were murdered by the Nazis. My father, Serge, somehow built a life defined by love, kindness, generosity, and understanding. And he spent so much time educating people in our community, not just Jews, but people in our community about the horrors of the Holocaust so that it doesn't happen again. And the normalization of hate today makes many of us take a step back and wonder if people have forgotten what happens when hate goes unchecked and what happens if people don't speak out and speak up against hate. And so for my father as a survivor, I'm horrified that he has to see what's happening in this country and just hopeful that this Remembrance Day, people are learning more about the Holocaust so we prevent it from happening again.
Sam, thank you so much for sharing that. I know so much of what we see happen in terms of hate speech stems from a lack of education and misunderstanding. So thank you for sharing that perspective. Donald Trump's classified document cases has been postponed. We'll take a closer look at the political impact of today's decision next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. We are following the breaking news that former President Donald Trump's classified documents case in Florida has been postponed indefinitely. David Weigel and Finn Gomez are here for analysis. David is a political reporter for Semaphore, and Finn is a CBS News political director. Okay, guys, so one trial postponed. There are plenty of others, but is this a win for President Trump that, we don't know when this is going to happen, and it was originally supposed to happen on May 20th.
Oh, it's obviously a win for him, but none of these cases have been moving votes all year. And really, since the charges were announced, the first thing they did was rally Republicans to Donald Trump, both with money and support in the primary. A lot of Republicans now say the primary was over as soon as he was indicted by Alvin Bragg. And even right now, there have been lots of cameras and lots of reporters in a courtroom in New York, and it has not broken through coverage of campus protests. It's not broken through coverage of Gaza. Democrats that I talked to, now not the only relevant party here, but Democrats who want to beat Donald Trump do not think either the indictments are hurting him very much or the charges or the delays are hurting him very much.
Could a conviction hurt him, Finn?
A conviction in the Alvin Bragg case, could it hurt him? I people in his camp believe that it won't. Like, they see that. I've talked to top Democrats as well. They don't like, as David said, they don't see that there's been really an effect. We're basically even at this point, 6 months out before the election. I did talk to someone close to the Trump team just before we came on, who says this news about the dox case is welcomed and expected. And they say justice always prevails in the end. And they feel absolutely bolstered by this. And they do expect there's going to be more campaign travel, more traditional campaign travel by the former president post this hush money election interference case. But, frankly, speaking to Republicans, speaking to Democrats, there does not seem to be any sort of inclination or indicator that this will have an impact from what we're seeing right now.
And,
at this point,
even though he isn't on the campaign trail, as we've talked about a lot, he is. Can you talk about how he is using his time in court in his favor?
Well, he's giving short press conferences of a sort every single day. He's getting in the news cycle every single day. He is complaining at a lot of these events that he's not allowed because of the trial schedule to campaign around the country. Now, he wasn't traveling that much during the weekdays, even during the presidential primary, with the exception of the 1 week before the New Hampshire primary. But that is a message that his voters hear. It's a message to Republicans, since they've been restacked at the RNC with his relatives and with party leaders he likes, has been raising a lot of money on. So he's been engaged in the campaign at a level that has satisfied the Republicans I talked to.
He's complained again. He's complained just today. He complained about the fact that he's not in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
The president is going to Wisconsin tomorrow, as we know. But he's complained about this. But frankly, to contrast Dave's earlier point, I looked across the cable channels today, and they were wall to wall all about the Trump hush money trial. At the same time, people close to the president and his campaign say this is the split screen they want. They want the president to be speaking about issues like the big anti-Semitism address he gave today, and then you contrast that with the former president and these lurid details of a adult actress from a few years back. So look at that contrast. They want voters to look at that contrast.
And David, I want to ask you about your new article out about Trump's giant soft spot for indicted Democrats. What do you mean by that?
Well, every time really since he was president, when he pardoned Rafah Blagojevich, former governor of Illinois, Donald Trump has generally taken the stance that if a politician has been indicted, if he's gone to jail, there probably was some railroading involved. That started with being annoyed that James Comey was part of the legal team that brought down Rafah Blagojevich, that sent him to jail for 14 years. He commuted most of that sentence. That continued with the former mayor of Detroit, Kwame Kilpatrick, continued with Bob Menendez, continued in the last week with Henry Cuellar in Texas. And there are Republicans who, in a kind of a cheeky, cagey way, say that they love these indictments because they get to run against the Democrat and they want to tie the party to it. Trump breaks from that and says, no, I'm sure that he's only been indicted because the Biden Justice Department is political and it's going after his enemies. It fits right in, sinks right into what he's running on. And yeah, I think there are some ways it's hurting him with voters who are not Republicans, not but already, but it's very consistent.
Right. So it's a new installment in the ongoing book that the justice system is rigged,
Absolutely.
which we are very familiar with. So David Weigel, Finn Gomez, thank you so much for both of your reporting.
Thank you.
TikTok and its Chinese parent company, ByteDance, are suing the Biden administration over a new law that could lead to the app being banned in the U.S. Representatives for the popular video sharing app allege the measure is unconstitutional because, in part, it violates Americans' First Amendment rights. The law would effectively prohibit the use of TikTok across the U.S. if it does not divest from its owner within a year. The app has been under scrutiny by lawmakers and other officials in Washington due to the potential national security threats it poses. President Biden looks to trump his rival's 2018 promise of jobs in Wisconsin, the failed plan and what the president is promising workers in the critical battleground state next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. In 2018, then President Donald Trump promised a massive Foxconn flat screen TV factory in Wisconsin would be the 8th wonder of the world. Well, that never happened. Fast forward, and tomorrow, President Joe Biden will be in the state to highlight Microsoft's plan to expand a data center complex there. Let's bring in our Aaron Navarro, who is covering the president's campaign. Aaron, it's great to see you. So President Biden is not only going to the state where Trump touted his project, he's going to the exact same event site, which feels like a little bit of trolling. So what message do you think the president has tomorrow for voters?
Hi, Weijia. Well, this is the contrast the White House and more particularly the Biden campaign wants to make with Trump, that President Biden is actually getting some of these infrastructure jobs done while President Trump did not. And as you mentioned, they are building, expanding a data operations center for Microsoft in Racine County. This is what the president is going to be highlighting tomorrow. And parts of it will be built on parts of the land that was actually allocated and meant for the Foxconn project back in 2017. But all this is coming as polls show that voters in these crucial battleground states believe that former President Trump, not President Biden, have a better grasp on the economy.
I'm glad you brought up recent polling, Aaron, because, you know, back in 2020, this was such a close race. And obviously, Wisconsin could make or break, one of their runs. So talk to us about what else you're seeing in these polls and what issues really matter to the voters as it stands now.
Well, let's start with the economy. In our latest CBS News Battleground poll of Wisconsin, specifically, only 33% said that they believe the economy is good, and that's among likely voters. 62% believe that the economy was better under former President Trump. Hence, you're seeing President Biden try and puncture that argument, that nostalgia that voters may feel, and as President Biden talks about jobs, infrastructure under his agenda. But Wisconsin is pivotal for President Biden. It's part of those blue wall states that Democrats, up until Trump, usually won in and helped deliver the 270 electoral votes that they need. Wisconsin's part of that blue wall, along with Michigan and Pennsylvania. And from talking to Democrats here in the state, they're expecting another close race. They said that up until November, Wisconsin is a 50-50 state, but after Election Day, it's more of a 50.3% to 49.7% state. And Democrats are hoping that they have the advantage there.
Well, Donald Trump is hoping that he can crash that blue wall, and certainly his campaign is spending a lot of time there in the surrounding states as well. So talk to us about what the Trump campaign is doing to try to win back the votes.
Yeah, in those moments where he's not in the courtroom, Trump was actually in Wisconsin, in Michigan last week, hoping to shore up some of the support that we've been seeing in some of the polls, maybe win some voters over. Even though Trump doesn't necessarily have any field offices here, as far as we know, the RNC has gotten involved in several election litigation lawsuits in Wisconsin, and the RNC is also holding their big convention this summer in Milwaukee, showing that they are looking to make a big play in the state. But so is the Biden campaign. They have more than 40 offices here in Wisconsin in conjunction with the state Democratic Party. Their headquarters for their state operations is here in Milwaukee, as well as in some rural areas. So both campaigns will be in Wisconsin and have a big Wisconsin presence in the next 6 months.
And we know you'll be there as well for us. Thank you so much, Aaron Navarro. Ron DeSantis may be starting a new beef. The governor has signed a bill that makes Florida the first in the nation state to ban the sale of lab-grown meat. The move comes even though the Food and Drug Administration declared lab-grown meat safe to eat back in 2022, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture approved its sale last year. There are similar measures underway to ban lab-grown meat in other states, including Alabama, Arizona, and Tennessee. Well, that does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.